Ladies and gentlemen, get ready. Now comes something that is usually kept quiet during family dinners. The sun had not yet risen over Los Angeles, but the city was already humming with its restless, caffeinated rhythm. In a cramped, overpriced bungalow in Silver Lake, Michael Crow sat hunched over his laptop, the blue glow of the screen casting harsh shadows across his unshaven face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trapped between inspiration and despair that purgatory every writer knows. The cursor blinked mockingly on a blank document titled Untitled Script Version 23. Version 23. He didn't need to open the other 22 to know they were as dead as this one. Michael was 45, though he felt older, his body weighed down by years of chasing a dream that always seemed to slip away at the last minute. His hair, once thick and brown, was now thinning and silvering, and his eyes, always red from late nights and cheap coffee, had a dull glint of resignation. He wasn't a loser, not really. He'd once sold a script, a low-budget thriller that aired on a cable channel that no one watched. The fees barely covered a month's rent, but they were enough to keep him tethered to the illusion that he had almost achieved success. Almost became somebody, almost became significant. The bungalow smelled of damp and despair, a mixture of old carpet and the lavender candle that Claire, his wife, lit to, as she put it, clear the energy. Michael hated the candle. It was one of her many indulgences, like the posters of French films she never saw or the yoga mat she used once every 6 months. Claire, his wife of 12 years, was 40 and still chasing her Hollywood dream, though hers was less about skill and more about fame. She was an actress, or rather, exan actress who had bit parts in commercials and once on a sitcom that was canceled after 6 episodes. Her IMDb page was a desert, but Claire acted like Spielberg was about to call. Michael glanced at his watch. 5:47 am. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours, but sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not when he was on a deadline and his agent, the ever absent-minded Gary, was sending vague messages about the interest of some people. Michael no longer believed in Gary's people, but he clung to hope like a life preserver. He rubbed his eyes and typed in diner night. Then he erased it. Too banal. Everything he had written lately seemed banal. The bedroom door creaked, and Claire's voice cut through the silence. "You're still awake? Jesus, Michael, you look like a zombie." She stood in the doorway, her silk robes slipping off one shoulder, her dyed blonde hair mussed from sleep. Even at this hour, she wore a light coat of lip gloss, as if she could be discovered right there in her own kitchen. "Thank you, dear," Michael muttered, not looking up. "Just trying to pay the bills." Claire snorted, crossing her arms. "Oh, please, don't start with your martyrdom. You've been writing for 3 years, and all we've got is a machine that coughs like a tuberculosis patient." She walked over to the coffee maker, her movements sharp and deliberate, as if she were performing for an invisible audience. "Maybe if you wrote something people actually wanted to read, we wouldn't be drowning in debt." Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. This was their routine, a rehearsed dance of barbs and passive aggression. He'd snapped at her before, reminding her that her auditions hadn't exactly garnered any attention from casting directors either, but then he realized it was no use. Claire's ego was a fortress, impenetrable to logic and reality. He stared at the screen, trying to put the words into words. Claire poured coffee into a mug, steam rising around her face as she leaned against the counter. "I'm having lunch with Zach today," she said casually, but there was something in her voice Michael couldn't quite catch. "He says he's got a lead on a project. Something big, indie, but with potential." "Zach," Michael repeated flatly. Zach was Claire's manager, a slick 30-something with a top knot and a habit of mentioning directors he'd never met. Michael didn't trust him, but then he trusted very few people in this town. "What project?" "Oh, it's all a secret for now." Claire waved her hand dismissively. "But he thinks I'd be perfect for the lead. Right for Sundance." She paused, then added with a smirk, "Maybe you should pitch him one of your scripts." "Oh, wait, I forgot. He only works with people who produce things." Michael's fingers curled into fists under the table. He wanted to say something caustic, something that would wipe that smug smile off her face, but the words wouldn't come. They never came when he needed them. He forced a tight smile. "Good luck, Claire. I'm sure this will be your breakthrough." She rolled her eyes and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her coffee mug on the counter, half full, forgotten. Michael looked at it, the ceramic glinting under the fluorescent light. It was one of those expensive handmade mugs from a farmer's market, impractical like everything else in their lives. By midday, the bungalow was stuffy, the air conditioner wheezing like an asthmatic dog. Michael had abandoned his writing and was now scrolling through X, scanning posts about the industry and the latest big deals. Each success story felt like a personal affront, a reminder of his own stagnation. He clicked on the profile of a screenwriter who had just sold a draft for 6 figures. The guy was 27. Michael closed the tab and squeezed his eyes shut, trying to clear away the headache that was starting to form. Claire was in the bathroom, rehearsing. Her voice came through the thin walls, rising and falling in a melodramatic rhythm. "You think you know me, but you don't. Yow never, I didn't know." A pause, then again, with a different intonation. Do you think that you know me, but this is wrong. You never say, I didn't know." She was preparing for an audition, no doubt, although Michael hadn't heard of any new casting calls in weeks. He pictured her standing in front of the mirror, her face contorted with the emotion she felt the role required, her arms flailing as if she were on stage and not on cracked tiles. He tried not to listen, but her voice was relentless, seeping into his thoughts like a dripping faucet. He wondered, not for the first time, why they were still together. They had met at a networking party 15 years ago, when they were both young and naive enough to believe in their potential. Claire had been magnetic, then witty, radiant with ambition, and Michael had been drawn to her like a moth to a flame. But the flame had long since died out, leaving behind ashes and resentments. He opened his laptop again, determined to write something, but his mind kept returning to Claire's dinner with Zach. The way she'd said his name, the way her eyes had lit up with excitement, it was gnawing at him. Zach was always dating Claire, always hanging around with promises of roles or connections. Michael had seen him once at a bar in West Hollywood, and he'd spent the entire evening talking about himself while Claire hung on his every word. Michael had felt like a third wheel in his own marriage. The bathroom door swung open and Claire stepped out, her makeup immaculate, her outfit a carefully chosen mix of bohemian chic and casual. She caught his eye and raised an eyebrow. "What? You're not going to tell me I look cute?" "You look cute," he said automatically, without a hint of warmth. "Oh, don't overexert yourself," she snapped, grabbing her bag from the couch. "I'll be back late. Don't wait up." She didn't wait for an answer, just slipped out the door, leaving a trail of perfume behind her. Michael sat for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had been. The bungalow was too quiet without her, but also too loud with the weight of their unspoken grievances. He tried to write again, but the words felt empty, as if they belonged to someone else's story. That night, Michael woke to Claire's voice, low and muffled, coming from the living room. He glanced at his watch. 2:14 am. She must have returned while he was dozing at his desk, his laptop open on the half-finished scene. He rubbed his eyes and listened, trying to make out the words. "No, he doesn't suspect anything," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "I told you, he's too lost in his own thoughts to notice. It's okay, Zach, really." Michael's stomach clenched. He sat up slowly, trying not to creak the chair. The darkness of the bungalow felt oppressive, the air thick with something he couldn't name. He strained to hear, but Claire's voice had grown even quieter, and he could only hear fragments of, "Soon, I can't go on like this. You know how I feel." He wanted to storm into the living room, demand answers, corner her with suspicions that had festered for weeks. But he didn't move. He just sat there, frozen, listening to the woman he once loved whisper secrets to someone else. The cursor on his laptop blinked in time with his pulse, reminding him of things he couldn't control. When Claire finally hung up, Michael heard her footsteps padding back into the bedroom. He quietly closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The lavender candle was burning again, its cloying scent filling the room. He wanted to smash it, sending wax flying across the floor, but instead he just sat there, letting the darkness consume him. The next morning, Michael woke to the sound of Claire humming in the kitchen, as if nothing had happened. He climbed out of bed, his body aching from another night in a chair. The blank document was still open on his laptop, the cursor patiently waiting for a story that might never happen. Claire stood at the counter, slicing an avocado with surgical precision. She looked up as he entered, her smile bright but fragile. "Morning, sunshine. Did you sleep well?" "Fine," he lied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. It was cold yesterday, but he didn't care. How was lunch with Zach? Her knife paused for a split second, but Michael noticed. "Oh, the usual," she said flippantly. "All talk, little action. But he has ideas. I think it could be something big." Michael nodded, sipping his coffee to hide the tightness in his chest. "Sure," he said. "A big one." Claire didn't answer, but went back to her avocado, humming again. Michael looked at her, at the confident movements of her hands, at her unrivaled conviction, and wondered how much of their life had been an act. Had they ever loved each other, or was he just a prop in her grand, illusory production? He returned to his laptop, opened the document, and typed int. Bungalow morning. The words felt heavy, real, like nothing else. He didn't know where this story would lead, but for the first time in months he felt a spark anger, maybe, or betrayal, or just a stubborn desire to keep going. He kept typing, the words spilling like blood from a wound, and for a moment he forgot about Claire, about Zach, about the life that was slipping from his grasp. For a moment he was just a writer, telling a story that might be worth telling. Los Angeles never slept, but at 3 in the morning the city was quiet, as if catching its breath before the next rush. In the bungalow on Silver Lake, the silence was almost tangible, broken only by the occasional hum of cars on the boulevard and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Michael Crow lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, where the shadows from the street lamp drew patterns like the cracks in his own life. Sleep would not come. His thoughts raced between another failed scene in the script and the phone conversation with Claire he had overheard last night. Phrases, fragments, her voice, all of it played in his head like a broken record. "He doesn't suspect a thing. You know how I feel." The words gnawed at his consciousness, leaving a bitter aftertaste. Michael rolled over, trying to calm his growing anxiety, but the bed felt strange, the sheets cold. Claire slept next to him, her breathing even, almost theatrically serene. He watched her profile in the dim light, the sharp cheekbones, the slightly parted mouth, the perfectly coiffed hair, even in sleep. She looked like an actress playing the part of Sleeping Beauty, and that only added to his irritation. Everything about her was staged, from her morning routine to the casual way she slings barbs at him. Michael closed his eyes, but the image of her face, her voice, her words would not fade. He stood up, careful not to break the floorboards, and crept into the living room. Claire's favorite lavender candle had long since burned out, leaving only a faint, cloying scent mixed with the mustiness of the old furniture. Michael sat down on the couch, resting his head in his hands. He didn't know what to make of what he'd heard. Confrontation, shouting, divorce? It all seemed both inevitable and impossible. He was a screenwriter, damn it, a man of words, not fists or loud scenes. But the words he'd chosen so carefully for his stories now seemed powerless against reality. The silence was suddenly broken by a vibration. Michael winced. Claire's phone was lying on the coffee table, the screen glowing, displaying a name, Zach. Michael froze. His heart began to pound, as if he were the hero of one of his thrillers, caught in someone else's house. He knew he shouldn't touch her phone. It would be a violation, an intrusion, an admission of weakness. But his fingers reached for the device, as if obeying some instinct older than morality. He picked up the phone, the screen still glowing. The message was short. "Are you still awake? We need to talk. It's important." Michael felt the blood rush to his temples. He glanced at the bedroom door, but Claire hadn't moved. The vibrating phone in his hand felt like a bomb ready to explode. He could have just put it back, pretended he hadn't seen it, and continued to live in this fragile, false equilibrium. But instead, he typed in the password, the same one Claire used for everything, the date of her first audition in Los Angeles. The screen unlocked. Michael opened the conversation with Zach. The messages were long, the chat pages going back a long way. He began to read, scrolling up, and with each line his gut tightened. This wasn't just flirting or professional communication. This was something more, something he was afraid to admit, but couldn't ignore anymore. You know he'll never understand, Claire. He's stuck in his own little world while you and I are building something real. Wrote Zach, I can't pretend I don't care anymore. This project is our chance, yours and mine. Leave him, and we'll do it together. Claire replied, I'm tired of his whining, of his genius that no one needs. He's dragging me down, Zach. But I can't just leave. Not yet. Michael felt the floor shift beneath his feet. He read on, each word cutting into him like a knife. Zach was promising Claire a starring role in something he called a breakthrough. He wrote about festivals, about red carpets, about her becoming a star and him being her guide into that world. But between the lines, it was clear that these were not just professional promises. There were words about hotel meetings, about nights when Michael thought she was at yet another networking event. There were hints of intimacy that he didn't want, but couldn't help but understand. He put the phone back, his hands shaking. Anger, rage, pain all mixed into one burning feeling that threatened to burst out. He imagined himself bursting into the bedroom, waking Claire, yelling at her, demanding an explanation. He saw her face change from surprise to contempt as she threw another barb in his face. What, Michael, did you think I was going to wait forever for you to write your masterpiece? He could almost hear her voice, her mocking tone, and it only added fuel to the fire. But instead of storming into the bedroom, he took a deep breath and reached for the notebook that always lay on the coffee table. It was an old, tattered notebook with yellowed pages and coffee stains. In it, he usually jotted down ideas, snippets of dialogue, phrases that came to him in the middle of the night. Now he opened it to a clean page, picked up a pen, and began to write. Not scream, not break furniture, not make a scene right. Int, bungalow night. A man, 45, sits in the dark, clutching his wife's phone like a grenade. His face is a mask of anger and pain. A woman, 40, sleeps in the next room, her breathing even, like an actress playing innocent. The silence in the room is heavy, like betrayal. The words came quickly, almost against his will. He was writing the dialogue, not for a script, but for himself, to capture the chaos in his head. It was a conversation he would never dare have in real life, but on paper he could be bold, caustic, merciless. Man, do you think I can't see? Do you think I'm blind, Claire? All your dinners, your projects, your nights coming home smelling like someone else's cologne. Woman laughs coldly. Oh, Michael, don't be dramatic. You've always been good at this, writing tragedies that no one wants to see. Maybe if you'd been a little more successful, I wouldn't have to look for someone to believe in me. Man, I believed in you. 12 years, Claire. 12 years I watched you play your role as a star who wasn't there. And all that time you laughed at me behind my back. Michael paused, pen hovering over the paper. His breathing was heavy, as if he'd just run a marathon. He felt the anger that had been boiling inside him transform into something else: clarity, control. He wasn't an action hero, smashing everything around him in a fit of rage. He was a writer. His weapons were words, his battlefield the page. And if Claire thought she could stomp on him, she was wrong. He wouldn't give her that power. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to immerse himself in an internal monologue that had been brewing for a long time. Why did I put up with this for so long? He asked himself. Her ridicule, her disdain, her endless complaints. He saw the way she looked at him not as a husband, not as a partner, but as a loser who had not lived up to her expectations. She called him a mediocre screenwriter, but what had she done? A cameo in a toothpaste commercial. A role as a waitress in a TV series no one remembered. She lived in the illusion that her star was about to rise, and she blamed him for the fact that her dreams were not coming true. but now he knew the truth. Zach, that young, cocky producer with his empty promises and his predatory smile. Michael remembered the way Zach had looked at Claire in that bar in West Hollywood, so sure of himself, as if she were already his. And Claire, with her shining eyes, her laugh that was too loud, too forced. At the time, Michael had written it off as her usual theatrics, but now it made sense. She wasn't just flirting. She was cheating on him. And worse, she despised him for not being Zach, not being young, not being successful, not being the man who could give her illusory glory. Michael picked up his notebook again. He wasn't writing to vent, but to capture this pain, this anger, this clarity, and turn it into something more. He began drafting a scene, not for his current script, but for something new, something he didn't yet understand but felt. It was a story about betrayal, about a man who loses everything but finds himself in words. He wrote dialogue after dialogue, each more poignant than the last, each closer to a truth he couldn't say out loud. Woman, you were never part of my plan, Michael. You were temporary, convenient. But now I have a chance, a real chance, and I won't let you ruin it. Man, ruin. Claire, the only thing I ruined was my life by getting involved with you. But you know what? I'm not broken. I'm still writing. And you're still playing the star you'll never be. He paused, rereading what he had written. It was raw, crude, but there was life in it. For the first time in months, he felt like the words on the page were his, not some fictional character's. They were his truth, his weapon, his way of taking back control. Michael put the notebook down and looked at Claire's phone, still on the table. He could smash it, he could storm into the bedroom and spill everything he'd learned. But instead, he stood up, poured himself a glass of water, and went back to the notebook. He wasn't going to give Claire or Zach the satisfaction of seeing him broken. He would write, he would create, and maybe in those words, he would find a way out of this trap they called marriage. Morning came too quickly, with gray light filtering through the curtains. Michael was awake, but he felt strangely alert, as if the discovery of the night had given him new energy. Claire was already in the kitchen, humming something from Broadway as usual, while she made her perfect avocado toast. She didn't notice him coming in, or pretended not to. "Good morning," he said, his voice calmer than he expected. She looked at him, slightly surprised. "Oh, you're early today. Have you finally finished your masterpiece?" Her tone was typically sarcastic, but Michael wasn't buying it. "Working on something new," he replied, pouring coffee. "Something personal." Claire raised an eyebrow, but didn't pursue the subject. She returned to her toast, her movements as measured as ever, as if she were rehearsing the role of the perfect wife for a non-existent camera. Michael looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt no anger, only cold, clear determination. He walked back into the living room, opened his notebook, and continued writing. The words flowed easily, as if they had been waiting for this moment. He didn't know if this would become a screenplay or a short story or something else, but it didn't matter. This was his, and in this, he was stronger than Claire, than Zach, than this entire town that was trying to break him. Michael Crow sat at his battered desk in the living room of his bungalow, surrounded by the early morning silence. Outside, Los Angeles was just beginning to wake up. Cars hummed in the distance, and the neighbor's dog barked at the garbage truck. The light from his laptop screen was the only source of light in the room, and Michael, hunched over the keyboard, stared at a blank document titled Working Title. Satire. He had been awake most of the night, but the fatigue had receded, replaced by something new, not anger, not pain, but a cold, clear determination. Claire's overheard conversation with Zach still echoed in his head, but now he didn't want to scream or break furniture. He wanted to write. His notebook, lying next to him, was covered with notes, drafts of dialogue he had started the night before. This was not another thriller or drama, as he had been trying to sell for the last few years. This was something else, a satire, venomous and precise as a scalpel. Michael had decided that if Claire thought he was a failure, incapable of making it in Hollywood, he would use her words, her mannerisms, her delusions against her. He would create a script in which the protagonist was a caricature of Claire, Not just a reflection, but an exaggerated, grotesque version that exposed her vanity and lies. This would be his revenge, but not in the form of scandal or accusations. His revenge would be on paper, in the words he knew how to put together best. He opened a new document and began typing. His fingers moved quickly, the words flowing effortlessly as if they had been waiting for this moment for years. He named the main character Clara close enough to Claire that she would recognize herself, but far enough away that no one else would point out the resemblance. Clara was an actress trapped in her own fantasies of fame. She rehearsed monologues in front of the mirror, bought expensive candles for energy, and hurled barbs at her husband, a screenwriter she considered a burden. Michael wrote without stopping, letting real memories and grievances spill into the text, but adding a grotesque edge that made everything simultaneously funny and painful. Int. Cramped apartment morning. Clara, 40, with her hair perfectly coiffed and her makeup too heavy, stands in front of the bathroom mirror. She holds a glass of green smoothie that she never finishes. Her husband, Paul, sits at the living room table, glued to his laptop. He looks like he hasn't slept in a week. Clara, do you think you know me, Paul? Do you think you can keep me in this cage of mediocrity? Paul, I'm just trying to finish the scene, Clara. Clara, a scene? Oh, please. No one reads your scenes. Maybe if you wrote something that didn't scream straight to cable, we wouldn't be living in this barn. Michael paused, rereading what he had written. It was almost word for word what Claire had told him last week, but he had heightened her tone, added a theatricality that made her funny but also pathetic. He imagined Claire reading the script if she ever got her hands on it, and her face falling in recognition. The thought gave him a dark pleasure. He kept writing, adding details that were all too familiar. The Clara in the script bought $50 candles that smelled like success and spent hours rehearsing monologues no one would ever hear. She called her husband a dreamer with no future and bragged about dating a producer named Zane who promised her the stars but ended up offering her coffee at a diner. Michael wove in real-life phrases that Claire had thrown at him over the years. You're dragging me down. If only you were more successful. I can't wait forever for your big break. Every word, every barb became part of the script, but he amplified them, pushing them to the point of absurdity. Clara didn't just despise her husband. She declared him a walking disaster to an imaginary audience, waving her arms like a bad actress on a soap opera. By morning, Michael had written 10 pages. It was more than he had written in the last 2 months. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his eyes, and felt a strange sense of relief. The script was raw, but it had an energy that his previous work had lacked. This wasn't just a story, it was a way to take control of his pain, to turn it into something tangible, a weapon. Claire emerged from her bedroom around 10 in the morning, her steps light, almost dancing, as if she were already rehearsing for a non-existent audition. She didn't notice Michael, who was still sitting at the table, or pretended not to. Morning, she said, heading for the coffee maker. Have you been up all night again? Seriously, Michael, you need to do something about that. You look like you've been run over by a truck. He didn't answer, just nodded, not looking up from the screen. Claire shrugged and began making her usual breakfast avocado toast, which she photographed for social media but rarely ate. Michael watched her out of the corner of his eye, taking in every detail. The way she adjusted her hair, the way she checked her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, the way she hummed a tune from an old musical. It all fit into his script. The Clara in his story did the same thing, but with exaggerated pomp, photographing her toast as if it were a work of art worthy of the Louvre. I'm meeting Zach today, Claire said, not looking at him. He says the project is almost ready to go. It's going to be big, Michael. Maybe I'll finally get out of this hole. Michael felt something inside him tighten, but he pushed it down. Good luck, he said calmly, continuing to type. I hope it works. Claire looked at him, frowning slightly, as if his calmness had alarmed her. But she quickly shrugged and went back to her phone, scrolling through her feed. Michael had gone back to the script, adding a new scene where Clara meets Zane at a cheap cafe she calls charming. and listens to his empty promises of fame while he orders the cheapest coffee. By midday, Michael decided it was time to test his dialogue. He got up from the table, his legs numb, and went to the bathroom. There, in front of the mirror, he began reading aloud, trying out different intonations to see how his words sounded. He was no actor, but years of writing scripts had taught him the rhythm of dialogue, its liveliness. He became Clara, portraying her with the exaggerated theatricality she loved so much. "You think you can hold me back, Paul?" he said, adding a dramatic hand gesture. "I'm destined for more. I'm the star, and you're just a shadow that keeps me from shining." He paused, looking at his reflection. It was funny, but it hurt. The words he had put into Clara's mouth were almost verbatim the same ones she had thrown at him in moments of irritation. He remembered how she had come home one day after yet another failed audition and said, "If you had been a little more ambitious, I wouldn't have wasted my life on these second-rate roles." He had swallowed her words then, but now they came back, turned into satire, a mockery of her own emptiness. He returned to the table and wrote another scene. In it, Clara stands in front of a mirror, rehearsing a monologue for a role she will never get. She talks about her unique energy and inimitable talent, but the reflection shows only a tired woman clinging to illusions. Michael added a moment where Clara accidentally drops her phone and a text from Zane appears on the screen. "Sorry, baby, the role has gone to someone else, but we'll still have a chance." In the script, Clara looks at the message. Her face contorts, but she immediately fixes her makeup and continues rehearsing as if nothing happened. By evening, Michael had written 20 pages. He felt exhausted but alive, as if for the first time in years he had found something worth writing. This wasn't just a script, it was his truth, his way of dealing with Claire's betrayal, her infidelity, her neglect. He wasn't going to show her the script, at least not yet. It was his alone, and he found strange comfort in that. Claire came home late, her bag carelessly dropped on the couch, and she went straight to the bathroom, humming something unintelligible. Michael didn't ask how her day was, and she didn't offer to tell him. They had long since stopped sharing with each other. Their conversations had been reduced to everyday phrases and rare outbursts of irritation. But now Michael looked at her differently. Every gesture, every word of hers was material for his script. When she said, "Have you been sitting at your laptop all day again?" "God, Michael, get a real job already." He didn't answer. He just mentally wrote down the phrase. It would become another line in Clara's monologue, another nail in her caricature. The next day, Michael continued to work. He wrote scenes where Clara confronted the reality of her talent or lack thereof. In one scene, she shows up to an audition confident she's going to get the part, but the casting director barely looks at her, interrupting her monologue with a question. "Can you just read the lines without all that pathos?" Clara responds by launching into a tirade about how she's misunderstood and storming out the door. Michael smiled, imagining Claire doing the same. He remembered her once coming back from an audition and spending 2 hours complaining that the director didn't see her potential. Now he had that moment in his script, but with the addition of a scene where Clara returns home, drinks wine from a glass the size of an aquarium, and yells at her husband for not supporting her dream. Michael went back to the bathroom to test the new dialogue. He stood in front of the mirror, imitating Clara, and began to speak, imitating her way of stretching out her vowels and making dramatic pauses. "You don't understand, Paul. I'm an artist. My soul is on fire, and you're just putting it out with your whining." He laughed at how ridiculous it sounded out loud, but it was precisely that ridiculousness that made the script come alive. It wasn't just making fun of Claire, it was showing how her delusions were destroying everything around her, including herself. By the end of the week, the script had grown to 30 pages. Michael felt like it was the best thing he'd written in years. It wasn't just a script, it was his way of reclaiming his dignity. He wasn't going to make a scene or demand an explanation from Claire. He wasn't even going to mention that he knew she'd cheated on him with Zach. Instead, he wrote, and in every word, in every line of dialogue, he felt himself coming back to himself. The Clara in his script wasn't just a caricature of Claire. She was a symbol of all those who live in illusions, who trample others for the sake of their own unrealistic dreams. And Paul, her husband, wasn't just a victim. He was the one who ultimately found his strength, not in screaming, not in revenge, but in creativity. Michael closed his laptop and looked at the notebook covered in his handwriting. He knew this script might never see the screen. Hollywood didn't like satire, especially this kind of sharp and personal satire. But it didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't writing for producers or agents or Gary's mythical people. He was writing for himself, and that was his victory. Claire walked into the living room, holding the phone, and said, "I'm going away for a couple of days. Zach is meeting with investors. This could be my chance." She didn't even look at him, expecting him to remain silent as usual. "Okay," Michael said, opening his laptop. "Good luck." She left, and he returned to his script. He wrote another scene where Claire leaves for an important meeting, leaving Paul alone. But in this scene, Paul doesn't sit in silence, wallowing in self-pity. He sits down at his desk, opens his laptop, and begins to write. And that, Michael thought, was the whole point. He wouldn't let Claire ruin him. He would write, and maybe in those words he would find not only revenge, but himself too. Michael Crow sat in his bungalow in Silver Lake, surrounded by the usual chaos. A stack of unwashed mugs in the sink, a tattered notepad on the table, a laptop with a document open and a blinking cursor. Outside, Los Angeles hummed with its usual cacophony, the hum of cars, the distant wail of sirens, the screams of neighbors' children. It was early morning, but Michael had been glued to the screen for 3 hours. His satirical script, which he called Star in the Mirror, was almost done. 35 pages of venomous writing, every line laced with his pain, his anger, his view of Claire and her illusions. It was the best thing he'd written in years, but now he faced a new question: what to do with it. He knew he couldn't just send the script to his agent, Gary. For one thing, Gary had been feeding him empty promises for 6 months now, without even bothering to read his latest drafts. For another, the script was too personal, too revealing. If Claire or anyone in her circle saw it, she would immediately know that she was Clara. Michael wasn't ready for that conversation, not now. He needed something else, a way to get his story out into the world without revealing himself. And then he remembered Tony. Tony Ramirez was an old acquaintance from screenwriting school, which Michael attended in his 20s. Tony had been a dreamer like Michael back then, but unlike Michael, he had managed to break through. Not to stardom, of course, but to produce at a small independent studio that made low-budget films for streaming platforms. They hadn't seen each other in years, but a few months ago Tony had messaged Michael on X just to see how things were going. Michael had brushed him off with something vague, but now the contact seemed like a lifesaver. Michael opened his messenger and found the conversation with Tony. His fingers paused over the keyboard. What could he say? "Hey, I wrote a script where I make fun of my wife who cheats on me. Do you want to see it?" That would have been too much. Instead, he wrote a short message. "Hi, Tony. I have a new script, satire, quite sharp. I want to try sending it anonymously. Can you help me get it to the studio, under a pseudonym, without my name?" He reread the text 3 times before hitting send. His heart was pounding, as if he were sending not a message, but a confession to a crime. The answer came an hour later, when Michael had already poured himself a 3rd cup of coffee and started rewriting the scene where Clara throws a tantrum over improperly toasted toast. "Sounds intriguing, old man. Send it to me, I'll pass it on to our studio. A pseudonym, no problem. What should I sign you as?" Michael thought about it. He didn't want anything that would give him away. After some thought, he chose a name, James Keller. Simple, neutral, unrelated to him or his past. He wrote back to Tony, attached the script file, and sent it off, feeling his insides clench with a mixture of fear and excitement. Then came the wait. Michael knew how the industry worked. Scripts could sit in drawers for months, even years, before anyone bothered to read them. He tried to distract himself, to get back to the routine, but his mind kept returning to the star in the mirror. He imagined someone in Tony's office opening the file, reading the first page, snorting, and putting it aside. Or, conversely, laughing, underlining lines, passing it on. These fantasies were both torturous and compelling. Claire was away at another meeting with Zach at the time. She didn't return home until late that night, throwing her bag on the couch and not saying a word. Michael didn't ask where she'd been, and she offered no explanation. Their marriage had long since devolved into a cold coexistence, with each playing their part. She the star waiting for a breakthrough, he the loser who hadn't lived up to her expectations. But now Michael had a secret, one he kept to himself like an ace up his sleeve. He wrote, and in it lay his quiet triumph. 3 days later, Tony wrote again. Man, your script is on fire. I gave it to our studio, and the guys came in. They want to discuss it. Will you call? Michael read the message 5 times, not believing his eyes. He had expected a polite refusal, or at best an indifferent, we'll think about it. But fire, that was too much. He felt the blood rush to his face and his fingers trembled. He couldn't call his voice, his name might give away. Instead, he answered, Great, glad to hear it. Let's do it via email. I want to remain James Keller for now. Not ready to reveal myself. Tony didn't ask questions, just forwarded him an email from the studio. It was short, but every word was like an electric shock. A small studio called Indispark was interested in the script. They called it cheeky, fresh, a satire that hits the mark. They wanted to meet with James Keller to discuss possible edits and the next step potential production. Michael sat there, staring at the screen in disbelief. His script, his revenge, his pain, it was suddenly real. Someone wanted to make it. He stood up and paced the room, trying to take it all in. This wasn't just approval, this was a chance. Not the mythical breakthrough Claire had dreamed of, but something real, something tangible. But with the euphoria came fear. What if they wanted to know who James Keller was? What if Claire somehow saw the script and realized that she was Clara? He imagined her reaction. First surprise, then anger, then her unwavering disdain. You wrote this about me. Is that all you can do? Michael shook his head, pushing the thought away. He wasn't going to let fear stop him. He wrote Tony, agreeing to correspond with Indispark via email, and asked him to keep his real name a secret. Tony, fortunately, wasn't the type to pry into other people's business. No problem, James. I'm your man, he replied, adding a winking emoji. The next few days were a frenzy. Michael exchanged emails with a producer at Indispark, a woman named Liz, who wrote with an enthusiasm rare in the industry. She praised the script for its biting humor and brutally honest nature. She suggested small changes, cutting a few overlong lines of dialogue, adding more visual gags to enhance the comedy. Michael agreed to everything, even though he was gnawed by doubt. He was afraid that by changing the script, he would lose its essence, its personal truth. But Liz was persuasive, and he trusted her instincts. Claire, meanwhile, went about her life, unaware of what was going on behind the closed living room door. She would come home from meetings, telling him about Zach's project, which she said was on the verge of launching. Michael would listen, nodding, but his mind was elsewhere. He imagined his script being turned into a movie, audiences laughing at Clara, unaware that she was Claire, his wife, sleeping in the next room while he wrote under a pen name. One evening, when Claire was away at yet another event, Michael decided to test out a new scene. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, holding the printed pages, and began reading aloud, imitating Clara. I was born for greatness, Paul, and you're just an anchor that's dragging me down. He added a dramatic hand gesture, mimicking the way Claire flapped her arms when she was angry. It was funny, but at the same time painful. He remembered Claire once telling him, You're my biggest mistake, Michael. Now the line was in the script, but Clara said it with such pathos that it sounded like a parody. He went back to his laptop and added another scene where Clara spends the last of her money on a dress for an important meeting that turns out to be just another empty promise from Zane. Michael smiled as he imagined Claire buying a $300 dress for a networking event, with Zach that never got her anything but praise from her social media followers. A week later, an email arrived that changed everything. Liz wrote that Indispark had given the script the green light. They were willing to commit a budget modest, but sufficient for a low-budget comedy. They wanted to start casting in a month and wanted James Keller to come to the office to discuss the details. Michael reread the email, feeling the floor shift beneath his feet. It was too real. His script, born out of pain and anger, was going to be a movie. He couldn't believe it was happening. He wrote to Liz, agreeing to meet but insisting that they communicate only via video calls and under a pseudonym. He explained this as a desire to remain anonymous for the sake of creative freedom. To his surprise, Liz didn't object. She wrote that the industry was full of weirdos, and James Keller was not the weirdest of them. Michael breathed a sigh of relief, but his fear remained. He knew he was playing with fire. If Claire found out, if anyone connected him to James, everything could fall apart. But at the same time, he felt euphoric. For the first time in years, he was not just a mediocre screenwriter, but a man whose work meant something. He imagined the film being released, the audience laughing at Clara, not knowing that behind her was a real woman, sleeping in his bed but dreaming of something else. He imagined Claire watching the film, her face changing as she recognized her words, her gestures, her life. This was his revenge, but more. It was his way of proving that he was still worth something. Claire came home late, smelling of wine and perfume. She dropped her bag on the couch and looked at Michael, who was still sitting at his laptop. "Are you writing again? Seriously, Michael, find a better hobby already." Her voice was tired, but it still held the familiar mockery. "Working on something," he replied without looking up. "Something big." She snorted, heading for the bathroom. "Big? Well, good luck with that. Maybe for once you'll write something someone will want to buy." Michael smiled, not at her, but at himself. She didn't know his script had already been bought. She didn't know that he, under the name James Keller, had gotten the chance she dreamed of her whole life, and he wasn't going to tell her. Not yet. He opened his laptop and began writing a new scene. In it, Clara stands on an empty stage, certain that this is her moment, her breakthrough. But the lights go out, the auditorium is empty, and she is left alone, screaming into the darkness. Michael knew this scene wasn't just about Clara. It was about Claire, about him, about Los Angeles, about dreams shattered by reality. And in this scene, he felt alive. Los Angeles was ablaze in the June sun, the asphalt of Sunset Boulevard shivering in the heat, and the air conditioner in Michael and Claire's bungalow wheezing like an old smoker. Michael was sitting on the couch, scrolling through emails on his laptop, when Claire burst into the living room, her eyes alight with feverish delight. She was waving her phone like a victory flag, and her voice, usually laced with sarcasm, was unusually excited. "Michael, you won't believe it. Zach just called. There's a casting call for an amazing project. The lead role, Michael, the lead." Michael looked up from his screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He knew immediately what she was talking about. The email he had received that morning from Liz at Indispark confirmed that the casting call for Stars in the Mirror would start next week. They were looking for an actress to play Clara, a caricature of Claire that he had created under the pseudonym James Keller. But Claire, of course, didn't know he had written the script. For her, it was just another chance, another ladder to her imaginary glory. Michael felt his insides tighten, a mixture of dark amusement and a strange regret. "Casting?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "What kind of project?" Claire threw her phone on the couch and began pacing the room, her silk scarf flapping behind her like a superhero cape. "Zach says it's satire, something edgy, fresh, with real festival potential. The lead character is an actress struggling to find her place in the industry. That's literally me, Michael. Zach's already got me auditioned. He says I'm perfect." Michael suppressed a smile. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. He had written Clara, drawing inspiration from her every gesture, every quip, every glance in the mirror as she rehearsed her great monologues. Clara was Claire, only exaggerated to the point of absurdity, with her pompous dreams and empty ambitions. And now Claire, unknowingly, was eager to play herself, or rather, a caricature of herself. "That sounds promising," Michael said, closing his laptop. "When's the audition?" "In 3 days," she replied, already heading for the mirror in the hallway. She adjusted her hair, squinted at her reflection, and began humming something from an old musical. "Zach is sending me scenes to prepare for. He says this is my moment. Finally, someone sees my potential." Michael nodded, watching her pose in front of the mirror, trying out different expressions. He felt like a spectator in a strange play where the main character doesn't know that he's performing in a play written especially for him. Claire was so absorbed in her dream that she didn't even notice him looking at her, not with the usual irritation, but with something like cold curiosity. What would she do when she realized? Would she recognize herself in Clara, or would her ego blind her, as always? That evening, Claire received snippets of the script from Zach for the audition. She sat in the kitchen, flipping through the pages Zach had emailed her. Her face lit up as if she were holding an Oscar ticket. Michael sat in the living room, pretending to work on something of his own, but his ears were hanging on her every word. She read aloud, trying out different intonations, her voice filling the house with theatrical energy. "You think you can hold me down, Paul? I'm meant for more." She read, adding a dramatic pause and waving her hand. "Oh, this is powerful, Michael. This is so real. I feel this woman. She's like me, only, on a bigger scale." Michael nearly choked on his coffee. He coughed to cover a chuckle and nodded. "Yeah, that sounds powerful." He turned back to his laptop so she wouldn't see the corners of his lips twitch. Claire had been rehearsing the scene where Clara chastises her husband for his mediocrity, and every word she spoke with such enthusiasm was lifted from their own lives. Michael remembered Claire once throwing at him, "You're dragging me down, Michael. I could be up there somewhere if it weren't for you." The words were in the script now, but Claire didn't seem to notice the similarity. She was too busy playing her great role. Claire stood up and began pacing the kitchen, waving the pages. "Zach says the director is looking for someone with charisma, with fire, and I know that's me. I can do it. This is my story." She paused, looked at her reflection in the glass cabinet door, and added, "I'm going to show them what a real star is." Michael remained silent, but inside he was torn between conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he couldn't help but admire her blind confidence. She truly believed that this role was her ticket to stardom, unaware that she was playing a caricature of herself. On the other hand, he felt a pang of guilt. He had written this script out of anger, out of pain, but now that Claire was so genuinely happy, he began to wonder if he had gone too far. But then he remembered her words, overheard in the night. "He doesn't suspect anything. I can't go on like this." And the guilt retreated, replaced by a cold determination. She wanted stars, and he had given her a star, just not the one she wanted. The next day, Claire transformed the bungalow into her own personal rehearsal studio. She moved furniture around to make room for stage space and read scenes out loud, ignoring Michael, who was trying to work in the corner of the living room. She called Zach every couple of hours to discuss audition details, her voice growing more and more demanding. "Zach, you have to talk to the director. Make sure they know I'm their best choice. I don't want to be just another candidate. This is my part." Michael listened to her calls, pretending to be engrossed in his laptop. He received another email from Liz, a producer at Indispark, informing him that casting was well underway and that they had already cast several actresses for the role of Clara. She mentioned that the script had caused a stir at the studio, a rare mix of humor and truth, as she put it. Michael wrote back that he was glad to hear it, but asked to remain anonymous again. He still wasn't ready to reveal that he was James Keller, not when Claire was so close to playing the role he had written for her without knowing it. Claire, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly obsessive. She had pasted pages of the script all over the house, underlining lines with a marker and muttering them under her breath. Michael watched her stand in front of the bathroom mirror, reciting one of the key lines. "I'm not staying in this dump, Paul. I was born for the spotlight, for the applause, for the glory. She said it with such passion that Michael almost forgot the words were his. He'd written them remembering Claire screaming at him after yet another flop, accusing him of keeping her in a cage. Now she rehearsed the tirade as if it were her own truth, and Michael didn't know whether to laugh or feel sorry for her. The day of the audition came quickly. Claire spent the morning in the bathroom, applying her makeup with such care as if she were preparing for a shoot rather than a casting call. She chose a dress she had bought especially for important meetings, a low-cut black one that she called elegant but with attitude. Michael watched her get ready and felt his heart beat faster. He knew that today she would be reading his lines in front of the director, the producers, people who had no idea that she was Clara, and he couldn't help but wonder, would she notice? Would she see herself in the lines? "Wish me luck," Claire said, standing in the doorway, her bag slung over her shoulder and a confident smile on her face. "This is my day, Michael. I can feel it." "Good luck," he said, and his voice was sincere, though for a different reason. He really wanted her to get the part. Not because he wanted her to succeed, but because he wanted to see her play Clara, to see her become a caricature of herself without even realizing it. Claire left, and the bungalow fell silent. Michael opened his laptop and began rereading the script, imagining Claire reading it to the camera. He wrote a new scene where Clara stands on an empty stage, certain that this is her moment, but the director interrupts. "Less bombast, please. Just be real." Clara explodes in response, screaming about her unique gift, and storms out, slamming the door. Michael knew Claire would have done the same. He'd seen her return from auditions, furious that she was not being played. "System, got it. I don't see the point in this." Michael was silent, staring at his laptop. He hadn't meant to interrupt her rapture, but Claire's words cut like a knife. She truly believed this was her moment, her triumph, not knowing that the script was his revenge, his truth, his way of dealing with her betrayal. He had written Clara to mock her delusions, her betrayal, her neglect, but now that she was so eager to play this role, he felt conflicting emotions warring within him. This was both his victory and his defeat. "Aren't you happy for me?" Claire paused, her eyebrows raised. "This could be my breakthrough, and you're sitting there looking like you're at a funeral." "I'm glad," Michael lied, closing his laptop. "Just thinking." She rolled her eyes and turned back to the mirror, muttering, "Always." Michael watched her back, feeling something new simmering inside him. Not anger, not pain, but a strange, dark satisfaction. She didn't know, and perhaps she would never know. But he knew, and that was enough. The casting went better than Claire could have dreamed. She came home that night glowing like a Christmas tree. "They were thrilled, Michael, delighted," she announced, throwing her bag on the couch and immediately grabbing her phone to call Zach. "The director said I captured the essence of Clara. They want me to re-audition tomorrow." Michael nodded, hiding a smile. "That's great," he said, opening his laptop to distract himself. He'd received an email from Liz confirming that Claire was a top contender for the role. They'd called her energetic and compelling, though Liz added that some scenes would need some reworking to heighten the drama. Michael had replied that he'd be willing to make any changes as long as he remained anonymous. He still wasn't ready to reveal himself. Claire, meanwhile, continued talking, oblivious to his silence. "Zach says this is my chance. He's already talking to the producers to push their decision. He thinks I could sign a contract next week." She walked around the room, waving her arms as if she were already on the red carpet. "This will be my big break, Michael. I always knew this would happen." Michael looked at her, his heart clenching. She was so happy, so sure of herself, and it was all built on his words, on his pain. He had written Clara to ridicule her, but now she was going to become her, and it was both funny and tragic. He wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to see her face change when she realized he was the author. But he said nothing. This was his secret weapon, his silent victory. The next day, Claire went to re-audition, and Michael stayed home, working on the edits Liz had requested. He added several new scenes, enhancing the comedy while keeping the satire sharp. In one scene, Claire throws a fit in a cafe, accusing a waiter of destroying her aura with his inattention. Michael smiled as he imagined Claire playing the scene, unaware that it was based on a real-life incident in which she scolded a barista for making a latte that was too cold. He received another letter from Liz, informing him that Claire had gotten the part. She was perfect as Clara, Liz wrote. Her energy, her mannerisms, it was as if the script had been written for her. Michael read the sentence 3 times, feeling his throat tighten. It was too perfect, too ironic. He had written the script to expose Claire, but instead he had given her the role of her dreams. Claire came home late, her voice shaking with excitement. "I got it, Michael. I got the part," she screamed, throwing herself at him with a hug she hadn't done in years. Michael hugged her back, but his mind was elsewhere. He imagined her standing on the set, speaking his words, not knowing they were about her. He imagined the audience laughing at Clara, not knowing that this was his life, his pain, his revenge. "Congratulations," he said, and his voice was calm, almost cold. Claire didn't notice. She was too busy with her victory, her moment. She started talking about the shoot, about the festivals, about how this film would change her life. Michael listened, nodding, but his mind was elsewhere. He had written this script to cope with betrayal, but now he wasn't sure who had won. Claire had gotten her part, but he had gotten his truth, and maybe that was enough. Filming was scheduled to begin in a month. Claire spent her days rehearsing scenes, discussing her look with Zach, and buying new dresses for the premiere. Michael watched her, feeling his script becoming reality. He continued to text Liz under a pseudonym, making final edits and discussing details. The studio was thrilled with the script, and Liz was already talking about sending the film to festivals Sundance, Toronto, maybe even Cannes. Michael couldn't believe it was happening. His script, his revenge, his way of dealing with pain had become something bigger. It was his triumph, but he couldn't share it with anyone. Even Tony, who had handed the script to the studio, didn't know the whole truth. Michael was alone in his success, and it was both liberating and lonely. Claire, unaware of everything, continued to live in her world. She rehearsed scenes where Clara mocked her husband, not knowing that these words were born from her own barbs. She prepared for filming, not knowing that she was playing a caricature of herself. And Michael looked at her, feeling his heart torn between a dark joy and a strange sadness. He opened his laptop and wrote a new scene, his last. In it, Clara looks at herself in the mirror, delivering her final monologue. "I was born for greatness, but greatness never came. And you know what? It's not my fault." The mirror cracks, and she fades into darkness. Michael reread the scene and closed his laptop. This was his truth, his end, and maybe it was all he needed. The Los Angeles summer suffocated the city with its heat, turning the streets into scorching frying pans and the film sets into saunas. On the Hollywood backlot where they filmed Star in the Mirror, the air was heavy with a smell of sweat, coffee, and cheap hairspray. Michael Crow, sitting at home in his bungalow in Silver Lake, was getting updates on the shoot via email from Liz, a producer at Indispark. He was still hiding under the pseudonym James Keller, and each letter from the studio was a shot of adrenaline. His script, its caustic satire, was coming to life on screen, and Claire, his wife, was playing the lead role, unaware that Clara was herself, exaggerated to the point of grotesqueness. Claire, meanwhile, threw herself into the filming process with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. She left the house every morning with her hair perfectly coiffed and a new outfit, as if she were already a star and not an actress in a low-budget comedy. She returned late, tired, but full of stories about the set, which she poured out to Michael, oblivious to his muted responses. "The director is a genius," she said, pacing the kitchen with a glass of wine. "He understands Clara, but, sometimes I think he wants too much comedy. This is a drama. It's about my soul." Michael nodded, hiding a smile behind a cup of coffee. She did not see the humor in the script, did not understand that Clara was not a tragic heroine, but a caricature of her own illusions. On set, Liz recounted in her letters, Claire quickly became known for her capricious behavior. She would argue with the director, demanding more emotional depth in scenes that were intended to be overtly comedic. In one scene, Clara was throwing a fit over a cup of tea that had been brewed incorrectly, and Claire insisted that her character cry rather than scream because it, she said, showed her inner struggle. The director, a young guy named Elias, tried to explain that the scene was supposed to be funny, but Claire would just roll her eyes and say, "You just don't understand what it's like to be an actress." Michael would read these reports and couldn't help but grin darkly. She was playing herself without realizing it, and her inability to grasp the humor made everything all the more ironic. It was the second week of filming, and Michael was starting to receive his first advance payments. The money had come into his account through Tony, who was still his middleman and the only one who knew that James Keller was Michael. It was a modest sum. Low-budget films didn't make millions, but it was more than just money to Michael. It was confirmation that his work was worth something. He looked at the wire transfer at his battered desk and felt something warm, something he'd almost forgotten, swell in his chest. Success. Not the big, flashy success Claire had dreamed of, but real. His words, his story, his truth had found their way. He didn't tell Claire about the money. She would have noticed if he had suddenly started spending more, but Michael was careful. He put the advance into a separate account, which he opened under a false name, and continued to live as if nothing had changed. Claire, busy with her filming, didn't notice his silence or the fact that he spent more and more time on his laptop, answering emails from Liz. She was too absorbed in her role, her breakthrough, to notice that Michael was changing. He no longer looked like the man she had called a loser. There was a new glint in his eyes, a confidence in his movements. But Claire didn't see it. She was too busy with herself. On set, meanwhile, Claire continued to test the crew's patience. Liz wrote that she refused to wear costumes that she thought looked too cheap and demanded more close-ups to show off her eyes. In one scene in which Clara was supposed to accidentally spill coffee on her husband and laugh, Claire insisted that her character apologize because it showed her humanity. Elias, the director, was on the verge of a breakdown, but Claire, as always, remained impenetrable. She believed that her vision of Clara was the only one, and no one could convince her otherwise. Michael read these reports and imagined Claire standing on the court, waving her arms and arguing with the crew. He had written Claire exactly like this, self-righteous, blind to reality, demanding attention she didn't deserve. And now Claire was embodying it with frightening accuracy. He didn't know whether to laugh or feel sorry for her. She was so close to the truth about herself, yet so far from seeing it. One evening, Claire came home later than usual, her face tense. She dropped her bag on the floor and poured herself a glass of wine without saying a word. Michael, sitting at the table with his laptop, noticed her mood. "Everything okay?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer from Liz's email an hour earlier. Claire had gotten into an argument with Elias over the scene where Clara caused a scene in the cafe. She wanted to add a profound monologue about her dreams, but the director refused, saying it would ruin the comedy rhythm. "They don't understand," Claire muttered, looking into her glass. "I'm trying to make Clara real, alive, and they just want me to act. It's not fair." Michael nodded, hiding a smile. "Maybe just do what the director says. Sometimes they know what's best for the movie." Claire looked at him as if he had said something absurd. "Are you serious? You, who have never done anything bigger than a commercial? Don't tell me how to be an actress, Michael." She turned away, her voice shaking with irritation. Michael said nothing, but inside he felt a strange satisfaction. She was playing his script, his words, and she had no idea that he was the one who had created this role she had so fiercely defended. Meanwhile, Zach, who had once been Claire's shadow, began to show up less and less. Claire complained that he was too busy, that he had new projects and new talent. Michael listened to her tirades, nodding, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew that Zach was like Claire, a man who lived on promises that were rarely kept. Liz's emails mentioned that Zach had tried to insert himself into the production by posing as Claire's manager, but the studio quickly made it clear that he was not needed. Michael wasn't surprised. Zach was a parasite, clinging to those he thought would bring him success. And now that Claire was busy filming, he seemed to have found a new target. Claire, however, didn't see it that way. She was still calling Zach, begging him to talk to the producers or get her more screen time. Michael listened to her calls from the living room, feeling his anger, once so sharp, turn to cold indifference. She clung to Zach, to his empty words, the same way she clung to her dreams of stardom. And all the while, she was playing the role Michael had written, unaware that he was the one holding all the strings. In the third week of shooting, Michael received another advance. This time, it was a bigger sum. The studio had begun to attract investors, and Liz was writing that the film was attracting more and more interest. "We think it might go to festivals," she wrote. "The script is too good to go unnoticed." Michael reread her words, feeling his heart beat faster. This wasn't just a success. This was his victory, his way of proving that he wasn't the loser Claire thought he was. He began to think about revealing his name. Not now, not while they were filming, but maybe after the premiere, when the movie came out. He imagined Claire watching the credits and seeing "written by James Keller," and then learning it was him. He imagined her face shock, anger, maybe even shame. But then he pushed the thoughts away. This wasn't about her. This was about him, his work, his truth. Claire came home that night with another story about the set. "Elias tried to make a clown out of me again," she complained, pouring herself a glass of wine. "I told him Clara wasn't just a joke. She had a heart, a soul." She looked at Michael for support, but he just shrugged. "Maybe that's the point," he said quietly. "Maybe Clara is funny precisely because she thinks she's a tragic heroine." Claire frowned, her gaze sharp. "What do you mean?" Michael shrugged, hiding a smile. "Just a thought. Sometimes comedy is about people who can't see themselves from the outside." She looked at him as if trying to figure out what he was hiding, but then waved him off. "You don't know anything about acting," she said, and went into the bedroom, leaving him alone. Michael opened his laptop and began writing a new scene. In it, Clara stands in front of a mirror, repeating her great monologues, but her reflection begins to laugh at her. This was his fantasy, his way of ending the story. He didn't know if this scene would be included in the film, but he needed it. It was his last word, his last shot. And sitting in the silence of the bungalow, he felt that he had finally found himself not in Claire, not in her dreams, but in his words, in his story. Premiere evening Stars in the Mirror in Los Angeles was steeped in that special blend of glamour and tension that Hollywood knew how to create like no other. The small downtown theater chosen for the screening was ablaze with lights, and the red carpet, though modest by blockbuster standards, stretched from the sidewalk to the entrance, surrounded by photographers and curious onlookers. Claire, dressed in a champagne gown she had bought especially for this evening, posed for the cameras with a smile honed by years of dreaming of stardom. Her movements were measured, like an actress who knew this was her moment. She turned this way and that, adjusted her hair, and laughed as reporters asked about her breakthrough. Michael stood off to the side, in the shadows of the crowd, watching her, a glass of cheap wine in his hand. He was here as her husband, not as James Keller, the screenwriter, and the role brought him a strange, almost painful pleasure. Claire was in her element. She spoke of Clara, her heroine, with such enthusiasm that even Michael, who knew the truth, wondered for a moment if she genuinely believed this was her triumph. "Clara is a woman who fights for her dreams, no matter what the odds," she told the young journalist with the microphone. "She's real, she's alive, and I put my whole soul into her." Michael suppressed a smile as he sipped his wine. She didn't know that Clara was herself, exaggerated to the point of absurdity, her illusions and flaws laid bare in caustic satire. And tonight, she would find out along with everyone else. Inside the theater, the room was half full, a mix of local film fans, critics, a few bloggers, and acquaintances of the crew. Michael took a seat in the back row, away from Claire, who sat closer to the stage, surrounded by several supporting actresses and director Elias. She looked like a queen accepting honors, and Michael couldn't help but admit that she was truly glowing in that moment. But he knew that light would soon fade. The film opened with a darkened screen and the credits, with the name James Keller appearing under the script line. Michael felt his heart skip a beat. This was his first public success, albeit under a pseudonym, and he still couldn't believe it was real. The audience grew quiet, and Clara appeared on the screen. Claire, in her first scene, standing in front of a mirror, rehearsing a monologue with such pathos that the audience immediately burst into giggles. In the audience, Claire tensed, her smile faltering. She clearly expected her character to be perceived as a tragic figure, not an object of ridicule. As the film progressed, the laughter in the audience grew louder. Scenes where Claire would throw tantrums over little things, like toast that wasn't toasted properly or the wrong energy in the room, drew roars of laughter. Michael had written these moments inspired by Claire's real-life antics, and now he could see the audience reacting exactly as he'd hoped. But Claire, sitting in the front, was cringing. System cringed, her shoulders slumping, her smile growing ever more strained. She had clearly not expected this reception. Michael, watching her from his corner, felt conflicting emotions warring within him. Satisfaction that his plan had worked, and a slight twinge of guilt for doing this to the man he had once loved. But the guilt quickly receded as he recalled her words overheard in the night, her betrayal with Zach, her endless taunts. This was his script, his truth, and now it was coming to life on the screen. The film's key scenes were particularly brutal. In one, Clara stands in front of a mirror and delivers a monologue. "I was born for greatness, Paul, and you're just a shadow that's dragging me down." The audience burst into laughter, and Michael noticed that Claire was gripping the armrests of her chair. She was beginning to realize that the audience was laughing not at her subtle humor, but at her character, who was too much like her. Her face, usually so confident, was now a mixture of confusion and irritation. She whispered something to Elias, who just shrugged, clearly not wanting to get into an argument at a premiere. The climax came when Clara, confident of her breakthrough, showed up to an audition that turned out to be a hoax orchestrated by her producer to distract her. The room literally erupted in laughter when Clara screamed, "You think I can't see how you're using me, Zane? I'm not your puppet." It was almost a verbatim quote from a conversation between Claire and Zach that Michael overheard that night. He saw her fidget in her chair, her face turning pale. She still didn't know he'd written the script, but she seemed to be starting to suspect something. When the film ended, the audience erupted in applause, but it was mixed with muted laughter and murmurs. Claire stood up, forcing a smile, and headed for the exit, where the journalists were waiting. Michael followed her, keeping his distance. On the red carpet, she posed again, but her smile was no longer as confident. Photographers shouted her name, but there was a hint of mockery in their voices. One of them asked, "Claire, what was it like playing a character who looks so much like you?" She laughed, waving her hand, but her eyes betrayed panic. The next day, the internet exploded. Critics and bloggers began posting reviews, many of them directly pointing out Clara's similarities to Claire. "Claire Logan embodies Clara with unnerving accuracy," wrote one critic in a local publication. "Her character is a mirror that reflects all of her real-life traits, from her theatrical gestures to her obsession with fame." Another reviewer was even more blunt. "Clara is a caricature of Logan herself, and her ignorance of it makes the film even funnier." Social media caught on. Memes started popping up on X and other platforms. Screenshots of Claire as Clara with captions like, "When you think you're a star but you're just Clara," or "Claire Logan plays herself without knowing it." One particularly popular meme showed her hysterical scene in the cafe with the text, "Claire Logan, I was born for greatness." Viewers' laughter. Michael saw these memes as he scrolled through his phone, and his heart sank. This was exactly what he wanted to expose her delusions, but now that it was happening, he didn't feel the triumph he expected. There was something almost tragic about the way Claire had become a laughingstock without knowing why. Claire, returning home after the premiere, was furious. She stormed into the bungalow, throwing her bag on the floor, and began screaming, "They laughed, Michael. They laughed at me. This was supposed to be my moment, and they turned me into a joke. She paced the living room, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. Michael sat at the table, pretending to read letters, when in fact he was watching her reaction. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it had arrived, he felt strangely empty. Maybe they were just laughing at Clara, he said quietly, trying to keep his voice neutral. Claire stopped and looked at him, her eyes narrowing. Clara isn't me, Michael. It's a character. It's art. But they think it's me, and I don't understand why. She grabbed her phone and started to dial Zach's number, but it went to voicemail. She tried again and again. Michael knew what was happening. Zach, who had promised her the stars, was gone. Later, he saw on her phone she'd left it open on the table that Zach had blocked her number. His last message was a short one. "Sorry, Claire, I have to move on. Good luck." Michael watched her as she sat on the couch, staring at her phone. Her face, usually so confident, was now confused, almost broken. She was alone, without Zach, without her dream, with a movie that had made her a laughingstock. And Michael, sitting in the shadow of his pen name, knew he had done it. His script, his words, his truth had shattered her illusions. But instead of joy, he felt only weariness. Over the next few days, the memes continued to multiply. Claire stopped leaving the house, avoiding the reporters who called asking for interviews. She sat in her bedroom, scrolling through her phone, her expression growing darker with each new post. Michael, meanwhile, was getting emails from Liz, telling him the film was gaining traction. Indispark was planning to send it to festivals, and there was talk of nominations. James Keller was becoming a household name in the industry, and Michael, sitting at his desk, felt his life change. He was no longer a failure. He was an author whose work had resonated. Claire finally spoke to him a week after the premiere. "You knew, right?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost broken. She stood in the doorway of the living room, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, the makeup she usually applied so carefully missing. "You knew it would be like this." Michael looked at her, his heart beating steadily. He could have confessed, said that he was James Keller, that he had written to Clara to show her the truth. But instead he shrugged. "I was just writing, Claire. It was just a story." She looked at him, her eyes searching for the truth, but he gave her nothing. She went into the bedroom, closing the door, and Michael returned to his laptop. He started a new scene, not for stars in the mirror, but for something new. It was a story about a man who loses everything, but finds himself in words. And in this story, he felt alive. Los Angeles in the fall was unchanged. The same hot air, saturated with exhaust and ambition, the same traffic jams on Sunset Boulevard, the same rhythm of the city that stopped for no one. In a bungalow on Silver Lake, Michael Crow sat at his desk, staring at the screen of his laptop, where an email from Liz at Indispark glowed. Film Star in the Mirror became a surprise hit in the dark comedy niche. After its Los Angeles premiere, it was picked up by several independent festivals and was now garnering rave reviews on platforms like Letterboxd and in X posts. Critics were calling it relentlessly sharp and painfully funny, and viewers were creating memes that were spreading faster than the California wildfires. Michael, still hiding behind the James Keller alias, felt his life, once a morass, beginning to move forward. Claire, on the other hand, was in free fall. The premiere that should have been her triumph turned into a disaster. Audiences and critics weren't just laughing at her character Clara, they were seeing Claire in her theatrical gestures, her bombastic dreams, her blind faith in her own stardom. Memes that began as jokes about her on-screen tantrums became a viral phenomenon. One of the most popular shows was her screaming, "I was born for greatness," with the caption, "When your agent blocks your number." Claire stopped checking her phone because every new post felt like a punch in the face. She locked herself in her bungalow, refusing to come out, and her voice, once full of confidence, now sounded hollow and broken. Michael watched it all, silently, without interfering. He saw her sitting on the couch, staring into space, a glass of wine she no longer finished. Her calls to Zach went unanswered. Michael knew Zach was gone. Liz had mentioned in one of her letters that he had been trying to hook up a new star with another project, but had quickly lost interest when it became clear that his connections weren't that great. Claire, who had once believed his every word, was now alone, and Michael felt no pity. She had chosen this path herself, and his script had only shown her the truth she had refused to see. A month after the premiere, Michael received another payout. The film, while not making millions, was bringing in a steady income from streaming platforms and festival screenings. The money, deposited into an account opened under the name James Keller, was more than he had seen in a decade. It wasn't rich, but it was enough to cover his debts, pay his rent, and, most importantly, give him freedom. For the first time in his life, he felt like he could breathe without having to look over his shoulder at Bill's or Claire's snarky remarks. He decided it was time. Divorce. The word he had been considering for months now seemed inevitable. He didn't want a scene, didn't want yelling or accusations. Claire was already broken not by him, but by the reality he had helped her see. Michael contacted a lawyer he had found through Tony, his old friend and the broker in the studio deal. The lawyer, a quiet woman named Rita, specialized in quiet divorces, where the parties settled without fanfare. Michael explained the situation to her over the phone, without going into details about the script or the screenplay. He simply said the marriage was over and he wanted to move on. Rita had the paperwork ready a week before. Michael signed it in a corner cafe, far from the bungalow where Claire was still hiding from the world. He made it clear that he had no claim on their shared car or furniture. He wanted only his laptop, his notebooks, and his freedom. He offered to let Claire keep the bungalow if she could afford the rent, knowing that was unlikely. Her career, already fragile, was now in tatters. After Stars in the Mirror, no one was calling her for auditions. Casting directors who had once politely answered her calls now simply didn't pick up. Zach, her last hope, had disappeared completely, and Michael heard her crying at night, thinking he was asleep. He filed the divorce papers through Rita, asking her to deliver them to Claire in person. He didn't want to see her reaction, didn't want to hear her accusations. He knew she would try to make a drama out of it, but he didn't care. His script had already said everything he wanted it to. Now he just wanted to leave. Claire received the papers on Friday morning. Michael was home when Rita rang the doorbell. Claire answered, thinking it was a delivery, and her face went pale when she saw the envelope with a legal stamp. She looked at Michael standing in the living room doorway, and her voice shook. "Are you serious?" Michael nodded, not looking away. "I think it's time for both of us to move on." She opened the envelope, her hands shaking as she read. You just do this, without talking, without anything." Her voice was high, almost hysterical, but Michael didn't give in. He'd seen this tactic before her attempts to turn everything into a spectacle where she was the victim. "We've talked enough, Claire," he said quietly. "You know why." She looked at him, her eyes searching for something, a hint, an accusation, a confession. But Michael gave her nothing. He didn't tell her he was James Keller, that he had written the script that had shattered her illusions. He didn't tell her he knew about Zach, about her betrayal, about her words overheard in the night. He simply looked at her, and there was only weariness in his eyes. Claire threw the papers on the table and walked into the bedroom, slamming the door. Michael heard her crying, but he didn't follow her. He went back to his laptop and opened a new document. He didn't know what he was going to write, but he had a feeling it would be something new, something that wasn't about Claire or her betrayal. His story with her was over. Meanwhile, Star in the Mirror continued to gain popularity. The film became a cult favorite among dark comedy fans, with posts on X featuring the hashtag #StarInTheMirror. Critics praised the script for its ruthless honesty and razor-sharp wit. One blogger wrote an essay about how Clara reflects the typical Hollywood dreamer whose ambitions become her own trap. Michael read these reviews while sitting in the cafes he'd started going to work away from the bungalow. He felt proud, but not the kind that expects applause. It was the quiet pride of a man who's done something real. Claire, on the other hand, tried to salvage what was left of her reputation. She gave several interviews, trying to present herself as an actress who consciously chose a difficult role. "Clara is a challenge," she said on one podcast, her voice shaking with the effort to sound confident. "I wanted to show vulnerability, a human side." But listeners weren't buying it. The comments under the podcast were full of ridicule. Does she really think Clara is not her? And Claire Logan is living in her own movie. Her attempts to explain herself only added fuel to the fire, and the memes continued to multiply. The studio that originally signed her to star in The Mirror cut all ties. Liz wrote to Michael that Claire had become a toxic asset to the project. "We can't work with someone who has become a meme," she wrote. "It's detrimental to the film." Michael wrote back that he understood, though inside he felt a strange sense of relief. Claire was no longer part of his story, either in the script or in real life. 2 weeks after filing for divorce, Michael moved out of the bungalow. He rented a small apartment in Los Feliz, using the money from the movie. The place was modest, with bare walls and creaky floors, but for Michael it represented a new beginning. He took only his belongings, a laptop, a few notebooks, a box of books. Claire stayed in the bungalow, but he knew she wouldn't be able to pay the rent for much longer. Her savings were dwindling, and there were no new roles. He felt no guilt. She had made her choices, and he had made his. The divorce was quiet. Claire signed the papers without argument, perhaps because she had no strength left to fight. She didn't call him, didn't write, and Michael was glad of that. He didn't want to hear her voice, her accusations, her attempts to take everything back. He wanted only one thing to write. His new script, begun in a cafe, was far from satirical. It was the story of a man who loses everything but finds himself alone. It was not an autobiography, but it echoed his own life pain, hope, quiet victory. He sent the first pages to Tony, who promptly wrote, "This is better than Star, you're on a roll, man." Michael smiled as he read it. He didn't know if this script would become a movie, but it didn't matter. He was writing for himself, and that was enough. Claire, according to rumors that Michael had heard through mutual friends, was trying to get back into the industry. She auditioned, but casting directors averted their eyes when she walked in. Her name had become synonymous with failure, and no one wanted to mess with an actress whose most famous role was a parody of herself. She tried to start a podcast to tell her truth, but listeners were few and the project quickly died. Zach, predictably, never returned. His number was blocked, and his X profile was now filled with photos of the latest star, a young actress who was apparently next on his list. Los Angeles, 3 years later, still breathed its usual mix of ambition and disappointment, but for Michael Crow, the city was different. He sat in a cozy office in West Hollywood, across the desk from a new agent, Emily Woods, whose name was beginning to resonate in the industry. Emily was young, but her reputation spoke for her. She found projects that others had overlooked, and had a knack for turning modest ideas into big hits. Michael, now working openly under his real name, felt unusually confident. His stage name, James Keller, was a thing of the past, as was his marriage to Claire, as were the years when he doubted his talent. Star in The Mirror became a cult black comedy, and while its success didn't make him a millionaire, it gave him something more: the freedom to be himself. Emily flipped through the pages of his new script, her eyes darting over the lines with the speed that betokened a professional. "This is powerful, Michael," she said, leaning back in her chair. "This isn't a star, but in a good way. There's more. Heart. It's a story about forgiveness, but without being saccharine. I like it." She smiled, and Michael felt a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. His new script, Shadows at Sunset, was about a man who loses everything but finds meaning in solitude. It wasn't satire, it wasn't revenge. It was his attempt to make sense of his last years, his pain, his growth. "I think we can pitch this to a few studios," Emily continued, tapping her pen on the table. "After Stars, your name is on everyone's lips. People want to know what you're doing next. There's interest from Brightpath, and I heard Neon Wave is looking for something along those lines. Do you want me to start talking?" Michael nodded, his voice calm, but with a little trepidation inside. "Yeah, let's try it. I trust your instincts." He smiled, and Emily smiled back. In her office, overlooking the palm trees and the traffic on the boulevard, he felt not just like a screenwriter, but like a man who had finally found his place. The conversation with Emily was light, businesslike, but there was a genuine energy to it, not the phony hustle he'd grown accustomed to over the years in the industry. She believed in him, and that was new. As Michael left the office, he walked down the street with a lightness he had never felt before. He thought about how far he had come from Michael, who sat in the bungalow, hunched over his laptop, afraid his words would never find a response. Star in the mirror was his revenge, his way of dealing with Claire's betrayal, but now he realized it was more than that. Creativity was stronger than screaming, stronger than fighting, stronger than physical revenge. He hadn't just made Claire look like a laughingstock, he had created something that outlived her illusions, something that lived on in festival halls and ex-posts. His words had become his power, and that discovery changed everything. Meanwhile, a few miles from Emily's office, Claire Logan stood behind the counter of a diner on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Sunset Brew was one of those places where coffee was $3 and the tables were sticky with syrup and memories. Claire, wearing a black uniform with a faded logo, poured coffee into tattered mugs, her movements mechanical, lacking the theatricality that had once defined her. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was now pulled back into a loose ponytail, and the makeup she'd applied with such care had given way to tired shadows under her eyes. She was 43, but she looked older not because of her age, but because of the weight of the disappointments she carried. The cafe was half empty, as usual in the middle of the day. An old man sat at the counter, reading a newspaper, while a couple of tourists were photographing their waffles. Claire moved between the tables, wiping down surfaces and collecting tips, a few coins, and a crumpled dollar. She tried not to look at the customers, especially those who seemed familiar. The industry hadn't forgotten her, but not in the way she had hoped. Her name was still mentioned in conversations, but only as a joke, a reminder of Star in the Mirror, the movie that had turned her into a meme. Casting directors no longer answered her calls, and her IMDb page was abandoned like old props on a film set. Claire was trying to hold on to what was left of her career after the film's failure, but every audition ended in a polite rejection, or worse, a mocking glance. In the end, she returned to where she had started 20 years ago, working as a waitress, only now with no hope for a breakthrough. That day, a man in an expensive jacket walked into the cafe with a face Claire vaguely remembered. It was Paul, a production assistant she had once met at a networking event. He ordered an espresso and a sandwich, not immediately recognizing her. When Claire placed the cup in front of him, his eyes narrowed, and then his lips twitched into a tiny smile. "Claire Logan, right?" he said, and there was something in his voice that made her stomach clench. "Saw you in Stars. Great role." His tone was polite, but his eyes were mocking. Claire forced a smile, muttered something unintelligible, and walked back to the counter, her cheeks burning. These encounters were happening more and more often. Old acquaintances from the industry who would come into the cafe, order coffee, and give her a look of condescension. They didn't say it out loud, but Claire could see it in their eyes. "How did you end up like this?" She tried not to think about it, concentrating on her work. She wiped tables, filled sugar bowls, smiled at customers when needed. But each visit was a sting, a reminder of who she was and who she had become. Her dreams of red carpets, of cameras flashing, of roles that would make her a legend, crumbled like sand. Star in the Mirror was her last chance, and she blew it, or rather, it destroyed her. The film became a cult classic, not because of her genius, as she had hoped, but because audiences saw Claire as herself a caricature of her vanity, her blind belief in her own specialness. Memes were still circulating online, and Claire avoided social media platforms to avoid seeing another screenshot of her face with captions like, "When you think you're a star, but you're just a waitress." That afternoon, the TV in the corner of the cafe, usually tuned to a sports channel, was showing a daytime talk show. Claire ignored it until she heard a familiar name, Michael Crow. She paused, holding the rag in her hands, and slowly looked up. On the screen was Michael, her Michael, her ex-husband sitting in a chair across from the host. He looked different. His hair was neatly trimmed, his shirt pressed, his eyes filled with a quiet confidence she hadn't seen when they were together. He was talking about his new movie, Shadows at Sunset, which had just won the Best Screenplay prize at the Toronto Film Festival. The host smiled as she called him a rising star in screenwriting, and Michael responded with a slight smile, describing how he drew inspiration from his own life, but without too much bitterness. Claire felt her throat tighten. She didn't know Michael was James Keller, the author of Stars in the Mirror, until the very end of their marriage. He admitted this to her only after he filed for divorce in a short letter explaining why he had written to Clara. "You wanted fame," he wrote. "I gave you the role you deserved." These words had burned her for months, but now, seeing him on screen, successful, calm, confident, she felt not only anger but also emptiness. He had won. Not with shouts, not with scandals, but with his words, which were now quoted by critics and discussed by viewers. And she was left here, in a diner with sticky tables and the smell of rancid butter. Paul, the industry guy, finished his espresso and glanced at her again. "Did you see that?" He nodded toward the TV, where Michael was still talking. "Your ex, huh? Looks like he went way overboard." His smile was almost sympathetic, but Claire caught the mockery in it. She nodded without saying a word and went behind the counter to avoid seeing his face. Paul left $5 on the table, more than his order had cost, and walked away, leaving her feeling like she'd failed her audition again. When Claire's shift ended, she stayed behind the counter to clean. Her co-worker, a young woman named Mia, had already left, and the place was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Claire was wiping down the coffee machine when her gaze fell on an old poster taped to the wall next to the register. It was an ad for a local theater where she had played a bit part a decade earlier. The poster, tattered and faded, still bore her signature, a sweeping, flourishing K full of hope and ambition. She had signed it in the days when she believed this was just the beginning, that her name would soon be on the posters of Broadway or Hollywood blockbusters. Claire froze, looking at the signature. Her fingers slowly reached for the poster, and she began to tear it off, carefully but decisively. The paper tore with a soft rustle, revealing the bare wall beneath. She crumpled the poster and threw it in the trash can without saying a word. It was her last gesture, her farewell to Claire, who believed in her stardom. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She simply turned off the light in the cafe and went out into the street, where Los Angeles greeted her with its indifferent hum. Michael, sitting in his Los Feliz apartment, was unaware of what was happening in Sunset Brew. He was working on a new script, his fingers flying across the keyboard, a cup of cold coffee on the table. His life was different now, not luxurious, but his own. He met with Emily once a week, discussing new projects, and each time he felt that his words carried weight. His name, not James Keller, but Michael Crow, was now known in the industry, and this was his victory. Not loud, not flashy, but quiet, like his character. He thought about Claire sometimes, but not with anger. She was part of his past, part of the story he told to the star in the mirror. He didn't regret writing that script. It wasn't just revenge, it was his truth, his way of being free. And now, when he wrote new stories, he knew that creativity was his power, his weapon, his path. He didn't need to shout or drama. His words spoke for him, and they spoke louder than he could have imagined. Now share what moment made you pause the video and think. Your insights are our gasoline. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.